Wander Middle-earth in the Lore of the Rings podcast, where we wander the world of J.R.R. Tolkien. In the Lore of the Rings podcast, we explore the inspiring tales and rich mythology of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings legendarium, and connect it to the movies and the new Rings of Power series, available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You'll find a new, lore-packed episode every Thursday. Come wander and not be lost with the Lore of the Rings podcast.
Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Leigh Newman, author of the short story collection, Nobody Gets Out Alive. Good Housekeeping wrote about the collection. The Alaskan wilderness is unforgiving, and so is life for the people who live there. In this arresting collection of stories, we meet people who are fighting not only the snowy tundra, but addiction, heartbreak, complicated families, and the demons so many of us carry with us, regardless of when or where we live. Leigh, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Well, if someone listening hasn't yet heard about your short story collection, Nobody Gets Out Alive, is there a story from the collection that you feel represents the collection?
Well, I set the stories, so they're all set in Alaska, but a majority of them I was sort of trying to write about Anchorage, because I did not want to write about like the traditional frontier narrative. And I wanted to talk about, what urban Alaska was like, what town life is like, because, people in Alaska do have things like Costco's and garages. And I feel like so many people think, I did live in the deep wilderness growing up, but I also, went to elementary school and we had a blender. Not always. I mean, one cabin we lived in had no electricity or plumbing. That's called a dry cabin. But we also had a house with like a blender and a garage door opener. And so I really do feel like the first story of the book, Howl Palace, and that's probably the best known story. It was in the Paris Review and it won a number of awards, like it was in Best American Short Stories. But that's a story about an elderly woman, in her late 60s who's had, 5 husbands, and she's living in a house in Anchorage on a lake where everybody has a float plane in the backyard. And she's trying to sell her house because she's lost all her money, and she's the only female homeowner on that lake, which is actually a very real thing. I based it on the only female homeowner I ever knew on that lake, just because so much of the, Alaska is majority male. Mm-hmm. And at the time, especially of that story, it can be a very male-dominated frontier environment, which I definitely grew up in, but I kind of am fascinated by Alaskan women. And so she to me emblemizes like that really complicated juncture between like strength and endurance and will, and then also, the need for tenderness. You know what I mean? Sure. She's really down and out. So to me, that story captured so much of what I was trying to talk about in all the women throughout the 9 stories or 8 stories.
Well, I'm curious, what is it that fascinates you about Alaskan women?
Well, probably, in some ways it's got to be a little narcissistic, I think, having grown up this way, where I did live on a lake in Anchorage with my dad, and we had a couple planes in the backyard, and for a long period it was, we had a pool table, and I was always hanging around with a bunch of my dad's friends, and we had all kind of shenanigans going on. It's not like that as much anymore in Alaska, but flying and almost dying all the time, and I say that lightly, but as a kid, it was a big adventure, right? Sure. We'd go out and the plane would be overloaded, and you'd go, Jesus Christ, I hope we make it over the trees, or, and a couple of times we almost didn't. We almost bit it a couple of times. And we laughed about it at the time. And I don't remember like living in terror the way people talk about, having so many brushes with death when you're young, but it's definitely in my mind. So I guess for me, there is always personally this I guess, rhinoceros that's on the outside being tough and strong and making decisions and, you know, wanting to basically survive and being very kind of hardcore about that. And then there's always this other part, you know, that is much softer and much more tender that I'm always trying to reconcile. How do you live with those two parts? You know, who do you show that tenderness to and who do you not? And I think many women, regardless of whether they grew up in Alaska or not, or grew up in a frontier lifestyle, you know, have to negotiate these two poles all the time. You know,
Sure.
how do you go out, make the money, take the kids? You know what I mean? And then
Yeah.
how can you be vulnerable? How do you do that when everything is sort of telling you not to be that way?
Yeah, that's a tough thing to navigate.
Yeah.
Well, I know that you wrote a memoir about growing up in Alaska and the tumult in your life after your parents divorced. That book was Still Points North, One Alaskan Childhood, One Grown-Up World, One Long Journey Home. I'm curious, when you were writing your memoir, were you also writing and submitting short stories at the same time?
I wasn't. I had written short stories, I would say like, you know, all throughout grad school and then afterwards. And then I wrote a really bad novel that no one will ever read. And what happened was at the end of the novel, I'd spent so many years. I made this mistake that many writers, young writers do, in that when I wrote the novel, I should have shared my manuscript with more people. Instead, I kind of hid and worked on it without a lot of feedback. And feedback would have really helped. Because it was beautifully, I think the sentences, I'm very proud of the sentences in that, but the story itself was flawed. And story is so much of what makes a book. You know, I really do believe in story. And that's what I call plot, but I think it's story.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I can wrap my head around it, storytelling. And when I left that novel and I realized it didn't work, and I was just devastated because, like, I had a young kid. I was working at like 5 o'clock in the morning for like 4 years. I moved into nonfiction, and I moved into nonfiction because I thought, well, I have messed up. I have not written a story I really like that really, you know, says what I want it to say, and the novel doesn't work, so I'll write nonfiction. And I did. I wrote that memoir, and then I also wrote just a ton of essays, and I was working at Oprah. So for about, I want to say like 8 years, I wrote nothing but nonfiction. And in a way, it helped me really find my voice. You know, in a way, it was more freeing somehow than fiction was, because I didn't have to make up the narrative, right? The narrative was mine. And then I just had to work on how to organize it and how to edit it, make it into a story. But when I finished that memoir, I said, okay, well, I've always loved fiction, and that was my first love. I mean, I even went to graduate school for fiction. I didn't even know anything about nonfiction or how to write it when I started writing it. And I just said, I've always wanted to write a perfect story. And by that, I mean a story that you would arrive at the end, and the end would feel both surprising and inevitable. And there'd be no hesitation on my part, because I would have figured out a way to jigger the story in a way that it flowered at the end naturally. Whereas when I had written stories before, I'd always like, how am I going to end this? Where is this going? I'm going to be seized by this crazy panic. And I feel like the story's kind of read that way. So I just started reading short stories. And I mean, I read every short story collection published probably, you know, in the past 20 years, plus all the classics. And I did not allow myself to read novels. I just read stories over and over and over again, just sort of hoping that, you know, of course, patterns would emerge about how you structure or tell a story. But then also I feel like it kind of seeps into your DNA, you know, like that's a lot of how I learned how to write fiction, because I never studied it. I would just read essays and be like, okay, I'm going to do something like that, but then totally different. You know, It gives you kind of a template or like a composition that gets into your brain and sticks there in different ways, and you can try different things. And the first story I wrote was one called Nobody Gets Out Alive, which later went into Harper's, and obviously it's the title story. But I must have struggled for, I don't know, almost a year moving through that story. It begins with this huge mastodon fossil that's in the living room of this wedding party, and people are having to jump over the tusks, which is it's a real thing in Alaska. I mean, people go out, they take their helicopter, they land on a glacier, and all of these, because of global warming, all of these fossils are coming right up to the surface, and you can literally pick them up and put them in your airplane and drive home or fly home. And I wrestled with it, but I remember coming to the end and knowing the end was inevitable, that the end would be with the mastodon again, and this couple kind of stealing one of the tusks and running home. That story was a lot about marriage too, and how little we know when we get into it and how much we learn very quickly. So to me, it felt like such almost like a celestial experience in that I understood the form all of a sudden, right? And I had all these things to say. And so it led immediately to the next story, right? Where I took a character out of that story and I moved her over. Her name was Janice, and I put her in 1975 and I wrote her story. So, and that's sort of how it went for me over and over again.
That sounds great. I'm curious, do you remember the first story that you had accepted for publication and what that felt like when you got that notification?
I do. It was like 2001. And by the time when I was writing stories, I know this is going to sound crazy. I was not writing about Alaska. I did not write about Alaska. I don't know what I was thinking I was writing. I think I was writing about things I didn't even know anything about, like the suburbs, because I think I'd read like a lot of Raymond Carver.
Right.
And, Laurie Moore. And I just did not, I think I was just copying people, right? Fundamentally, we're trying to be, you're young, right? But the first story I ever had, it was at the Northwest Review. And they actually wrote me a letter saying your story's been accepted. And I was just like, I was just flabbergasted, just so, and I'd liked the Northwest Review. I'd read a lot of, I would say that to other people who are writers. I was submitting at that time, I'd submit to 20 places a month and I had like a little chart, it's not like now where it's all codified, and I would send out my little stories and I would make myself do it because I was terrified. It was like I'd written for years before and never submitted anything. I was too afraid. And I set this chart to myself, in the bathroom, or on the first of the month, I had to send 20 stories out to different magazines, and I had to research these magazines, send them to the places I really loved, not just the places I thought I could get into.
Right.
And that actually worked. That part worked, because then I started getting a lot of stories in.
That's great.
All those suburban stories are weird, but they were all published.
Well, I'm curious, when you were working on the short stories for this collection, and when you write short stories that were not in the collection, when you sit down to write a new story, I'm curious about the process for you. Do you have the entire story in your head?
Oh, not at all.
Do you just write a first line and see where the narrative takes you?
Yeah, that I really have to have a first line. And sometimes the first line will take me, and I mean like months. I'm not joking. Like it kind of establishes the voice, and it's got to be composed in some way. And frequently I'll fixate on something. So it helps me kind of get into this. I don't want to like make it like mystical and weird, but it is kind of,
Sure.
It helps me get into this dream state. So I fixated on that mastodon skull, and I wrote pages and pages and pages about the mastodon skull. And then I realized, oh no, we need, it's a story. Like we got to get, we got to take these 8 pages about a mastodon skull and shrink it down to like 3 paragraphs and get some people in here, have some stakes. Like some emotional life here. Cause that's for me, so much of writing is not, it can't just be about the pretty language. It's got to be about the story. And then it's got to be some kind of like really like meaning, and heart in it, or it doesn't quite work for me. That's my goal. I want all the goodies. And so I will, that object that I fixate on could be, there's one about a corn, like a Mazola corn oil bottle. That was one thing I fixed on. And another one in How Palace, that story we were talking about, it was the house. Right. Originally, I fixated on the wrong thing. I fixated on this wild black lab, a vicious black lab, actually, which I thought was hilarious, only because I've had one.
Yeah, they're not vicious.
And yeah, she was, I know they're not vicious, but sometimes, you got a rogue dog. And so that will sort of like meditate and marinate. And that will take me quite a while, because through the object and through working with the language on the first 3 pages, the people will come out of it. How do they react to that dog or that house or that mastodon skull? How do we, who are the people that come out of that? And so I will work on that first, probably once the people start to come out, it'll be about 10 pages. That's my setup. And I will work on that for months. And then I stop because I'll get stuck. I have all the people, I have the place, I have the setup, but I don't know what's going to happen with the story at all. And usually at that point, I just let go and start another story. And I'll take 3 or 4 of these beginnings, and I go to Alaska, and I stay at my friend Jeff's cabin, and I will literally finish them in a row. Just I'll write one, and I write the story out, and the next 20 pages to the ending. Usually it takes me 3 to 4 days. It's very remote there, and I live in a little cabin by a rushing creek, and I just write 24 hours a day till the story is done. Then when it's done, I go for this crazy run, and I'm not even a runner. I don't even know how to run really, but I run to like get rid of my own, craziness, and then I'll come back, and I'll start another one, and I'll write that one out. And so at the end, every time I go there, I usually go there for 3 weeks. I'll come out with 4 stories or 3 stories done.
Wow. And so what is the revision process like for you? Are you revising throughout this whole process that you just described?
Yeah, I mean, I write in a time-consuming way in that it's hard for me to move forward until I know that the paragraphs and sentences are right.
Right.
And that the feel of everything is right. I can't, because I've learned that when I try and force it and just go forward, I'll make a mistake. Like, because of the language and the setup or the people aren't right, I'll make the wrong decision. I'll make them do the wrong thing. And then it'll all be false, and I have to cut all that and go back and find out the moment where I lied to myself or I lied to like the emotions of the story and made someone do something or say something that's not really where I want it to be, like not capturing the feeling that's right. So I just literally go over and over and over and over, starting at page 1, and then I'm able to add a page by the end of 4 hours, right? Maybe sometimes, sometimes not.
Right.
It's a very different, story writing is just a very intricate, jewel-like, you feel very much like a jeweler, putting a little prong around the diamond and, putting another prong and then taking that one out until you get it really set. It's totally different, I have found, because I'm writing a novel now for Scribner. And that is, you don't do that. You have to keep moving. You have to keep moving in the novel, I'm learning. And it's a really hard learning process. I just, I remember spending in my novel, I spent I'm not kidding you, I think 3 months just writing about these. It's set in the North Pole, which is a town. It's, and it's a very remote town outside Fairbanks. And I was writing about opera records, old-fashioned opera records that this girl is listening to every day when her mother goes to work. And at some point I, wrote, 20 pages about the opera records. And then I realized, okay, there's literally no story here. She's been alone in a cabin for 20 pages. Nobody cares. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I had to start a new kind of storytelling, which has actually been a lot of fun. Every day something happens.
That's good. So I'm curious, how is this novel writing experience going compared to that first one that you said you should have shown to people?
Well, I think the first one was really based in Anchorage, and it was really about the same concerns as this story. I just figured out a way to tell the story better through stories instead of a novel. And so I didn't want to go back to the same material of kind of swashbucklers of the wilderness. Often some people with huge amounts of wealth, some people with nothing, which is sort of where I grew up in this very economically diverse, like a lot of frontier towns, right? The haves and the have-nots. You grow up in a big bundle of kids running everywhere with, for me, a tube top and a pair of jeans and quite frankly, a bear gun. So we didn't get killed. But I kind of wrote that, and those stories went all the way from 1915 at the founding of Anchorage all the way to probably 2017, when Uber first arrived. That was a real thing I was talking about was Uber. But in this new novel, it's actually a historical novel, and because when I wrote that story about 1915, I realized I just loved writing about the past. So this novel is actually set in 1953, right after World War II, when there was this huge influx of people to Alaska, and
Right.
it's about my grandmother, who was a Porch Creek Indian who came up from Alabama, and it's about her running a moonshine business, and founding what was the only women's social club in an Anchorage, and it was like a place for fancy ladies to come have drinks. My grandmother did not found this club. This is where things get to be fiction, right? I've always heard about this club. It was called Club 25, and so but I do love the idea of an all women's moonshine speakeasy. It's what they called refined dining, and and so I'm writing about that. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to write.
So I'm curious, what prompted the move of your grandmother from Alabama to Anchorage?
Well, she didn't. That's the thing.
Oh,
My
she didn't.
My grandmother did not move there.
Oh, okay.
I think
I
this
must
is
have
like,
misunderstood you.
No. I probably said it wrong. So my grandmother, I'm writing about my grandmother and her childhood growing up in Alabama.
Right, right.
She
Okay.
adopted a white woman, which is my mother. And there was all kinds of complications around this situation. And I've always felt I'm serious. Like, I feel very sad. I feel somehow my grandmother's like been erased from history. I can't, the way she lived her life and the racial situation when she was living in, I feel like she was disappeared. She passed as white, or tried to, for a lot of her life. And so I could not just set it in Alabama. That's too hard. It's too close to the truth. So I moved her to Alaska and gave her opportunities that she wouldn't have had. But I feel like they tie really into why people go to Alaska, like what they are running from.
Sure.
And what they hope to get out of this thing, and what they get out of it and what they don't. The dreams that are realized and the dreams that are not realized at all, because it's still, it's still America. It's still, you know what I mean? It's just further away.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I kind of just wanted to give her, I don't know, a fantasy life, like put everything I knew about her and what she'd been through, and then put it in a different context. Because I do know she was a moonshiner, and she worked in Mobile, and she ran bottles up and down on the, her husband that she married was a white man in the Merchant Marine, and they ran bottles of alcohol up and down the East Coast. And, she was a real, like, soft gangster. You know
That's
what I mean?
great.
She
Yeah,
really
yeah.
was. So putting her in Alaska just makes it safer for me. It lets my imagination free.
Sure.
So I'm not so confined to what actually happened.
That's great. Well, I'm curious, what writing advice would you offer for those who are working on their own stories or novels?
Well, the first thing would be just to read. Read a lot and let it seep into you in the way that I was talking about, because I made that mistake with my memoir. I didn't know anything about writing a memoir. I sold it on 80 pages, and I did not read enough memoirs. I somehow had that idea that, like, if you read really other talented people, they'll somehow take over your voice,
Right.
which they will not. If anything, all they're doing by reading, you get all these different strategies and different ideas, like you're in a dialogue. And so that's why I really did that with the stories. And I think they improved my writing. It was almost like I got my own personal private PhD in short stories just by reading and making notes and breaking things down and thinking about it. So that would be my first thing. And then my second thing would be not to go too fast. I really do think so much of what makes vivid, emotional, powerful writing is being able to slow yourself down and not run through anything in a couple of sentences and move on, but actually be there for a while. Do you know what I mean? Be there when the awful dinner table goes quiet. Stay in the quiet and look at what everybody's doing at the table. You know what I mean? While no one's talking because someone just took a big a dookie in the conversation. And I do think that's what I see over and over again. I teach for NYU, and always I'm writing in the margin, like, wait a minute, this is a great moment. Stay there, stay there in that moment. That's it.
That's great. Well, I'm curious, what novels or short story collections or memoirs have you read recently that you enjoyed?
I've read a couple of great books right now. I'm reading Water Dancer. I also just read Our Country Friends by Gary Scheingard, and that was absolutely terrific. it was about a group of friends who go away during the pandemic to live in a bungalow community. And it was told sort of like a Russian novel with with an omniscient narrator jumping from character to character, which you never see. It's so old fashioned. It's a wonderful technique. I don't know whether I'll ever be able to do it. Pachinko also had it, which I loved. But it's also funny and really powerful. And then I read this beautiful novel this week called What We Do in the Dark, or What We Do in the Dark by Michelle Hart. And it's about a young woman having an affair with her professor in college. And it's the opposite of that. It's one narrator. It's almost like unbearably pure, an unbearably pure examination of loneliness and how she uses time. And I really read it in a day and a half. And I got a lot out of it, because it was so interior. And that's sometimes the opposite of what I do. And it was so spare. And I tend to be so lavish. I never saw an adjective I didn't love. And I love adverbs too. I want to go all the way. I love I love how far Flannery O'Connor will go with her prose. I love Southern writers and how, they'll just talk about, dirt, for a long time. But that's where my heart is, the Russians and the Southern writers. Sure. Always. I want that exorbitancy and I want that lavishness of prose. But reading the opposite sometimes can be really enlightening,
Yeah. That's great. That sounds great. Well, where can people find you online if they'd like to learn more about you and your new short story collection and your memoir?
Oh, thanks. I have LeighNewman.com. You can go to my website. It has a lot of the, PR clips. And I'm also, I really am on Instagram a lot. And I think I'm Leigh Newman Lives. Leigh Newman Lives, Lives. And I'm constantly on there posting things, putting up, I'll put links. I have a link tree there that gives you access to actually a lot of the stories were published. And so the ones I know from the Paris Review are up there and Harper's and Electric Literature. So I guess, honestly, I hate to be so obscenely 21st century, but yeah, I think the easiest way to find me is on Instagram.
That's great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Leigh Newman, author of the short story collection, Nobody Gets Out Alive. The collection is on sale now, so go buy a copy. And Leigh, thanks for doing this interview.
No, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot.
You have a vision for your business. Your priority might be to
expand facilities
or
bring in the best talent.
At Century Insurance, we listen, learn, and work to understand your business and your plans to help protect your
new locations.
As your business evolves and your vision comes true, Century, right by you. Property and casualty coverages and underwritten and safety services are provided by a member of the Century Insurance Group, Stevens Point, Wisconsin. For a complete listing of companies, visit Century.com. Policies, coverages, benefits, and discounts are not available in all states. See policy for complete coverage details.